Good morning and welcome to our class on the book of Romans. Today we have a flex period, which means we get to talk about whatever we want. But I do have some things planned for us this morning. As you can see up on the screen, the first question that I asked is, what are the ways in which God has proven righteous so far? And what this implies is we want to spend some time going back and remembering that our purpose for the writing of the letter to the Romans was to explain in many different ways, dozens of different ways, why God is righteous under the circumstances of Paul's preaching. And Paul is to some extent defending his own writings and teachings about the righteousness of God, about the incorporation of the Gentiles, and how the Jews might view the Gentiles being brought in. So Paul is going through a series of explanations as to how God can be seen as righteous, and we've seen several of those already. So I want to review a couple of those with you right now. First of all, God is righteous because he's fair, because the Gentiles are rightly condemned and without excuse. And as an illustration of that, in verse 21 of chapter 1, the entire chapter is an outpouring of God's wrath over the sins of the Gentiles. And he says, as he explains that outpouring of wrath, that the Gentiles chose to live the way they did. The Gentiles were not just living in absence of any knowledge of God. There were ways in which they should have known that God exists, and they chose not to recognize that God was who he was. Even though God didn't choose the Gentiles to reveal his word to them, there were some things that they should have known, and they acted contrary to what they should have known, and that's why God was angry with them, rightfully angry, and God was righteous in being angry at them. The Gentiles innately knew that their bad attitudes and behavior made them worthy of death. Now, sometimes we get away from this notion that sin makes us worthy of death. Sometimes we get away from the notion that sin is really as sinful as it is, that sin is bad, that sin is deadly. It has deadly consequences. It had deadly consequences at the beginning with Adam and Eve, and the consequences of sin have continued to be deadly over the years. And so the wrath of God against sin is righteously also deadly, and the wages of sin, the fair recompense for our sin, is death. We deserve to die. And he kind of leaves it that way. And the Jews, you might say, all the Jews, you could just kind of hear them cheering. Yeah, lay it on those Gentiles. But little did they know what was coming next. God is fair because the Jews were rightly condemned for acting like Gentiles. Chapter 2 and verse 2 is an illustration of that. The Jews thought they were all of that. All of what? Well, Romans chapter 2, verses 17 through 20, Paul's laying it on thick. He's telling the Jews how they view, giving them a look at how they look at themselves. He says, you call yourself a Jew because you rely on the law, you boast in God, you know his will, you approve what is excellent, you're instructed from the law. Congratulations. You're sure that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of children, possessing in the law the embodiment of knowledge and truth. And they were, weren't they? The Jews thought they were all that. But in chapter 3, verse 9, Paul tells them, but you're no better off. You're no better off than those Gentiles. Why? Because God's name is blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you. That's one of the dangers, of saying that you belong to God, is that people are going to be watching you to see. If you act like someone they think should be characterized by someone who belongs to God. People will hold you to a different standard. And they looked at the Jews and they saw the same kind of behavior that they saw among the Gentiles, and they said, what good is it to belong to God? If you're going to act like everybody else, what difference does it make? God is fair in that he shows no respect of persons in regards to judgment, in regards to his wrath on sin. It doesn't matter if you're a Jew or if you're a Gentile. Sinners were viewed and treated the same, chapter 2 and verse 12. That's why God is righteous, because he treats all sin the same, no matter who it comes from. And we say God is righteous, and we've said that means that God is as he should be. We would be disappointed in God if he treated people differently just because of their race. Just because they came from a different country or came from a different line of descendants, that God would treat them differently, we would say that was unfair. But we find that God is as he should be. God is righteous. He's righteous because everyone's treated the same in regards to their sin. They're all guilty. And they're all under wrath. Circumcision, he says, is only beneficial when you keep the law, not when you break it. Chapter 2, verse 25. So great, you're circumcised. You think you're all that just because you're circumcised. And Paul says, no. Circumcision is only good for you when you keep the law. It's not good for you when you break it. You're breaking it, you're guilty, just like everybody else. A Jew is not one who is a Jew outwardly, but one who is a Jew inwardly. And he'll give more meaning to that as he goes through his further explanations. Circumcision is not of the flesh, but of the heart. Not of the letter, but of the Spirit. And the Gentiles all breathed a sigh of relief, and they said, so it's not just us. And the Jews now, recognizing their own guilt, realize that they're also subject to the wrath of God. God is fair because all who are under wrath have sinned. They're all guilty. He's not going to place anybody under wrath who hasn't sinned. Nobody's going to be subject to the wrath of God who's completely innocent. Only the guilty. You know any? So how are you feeling about yourself right about now? Yeah, the Gentiles, the Jews, they were all under the wrath of God because they had all sinned. Where do we stand in regards to justification by the things that we do? By doing all the right things. There is none righteous, he says, no, not one. So here we are, on the same plane with those Jews and Gentiles that he spoke to in chapters 1 and 2. There is none righteous, no, not one. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Every human starts out in the same place, bankrupt in God's sight, in need of grace, helpless in the face of God's wrath against disobedience. None of us can elevate ourselves above anyone else in this regard. God is gracious, a righteous ruler. That's as a righteous ruler should be, because Jesus was extended as an appeasement of wrath. So God, being a righteous God, being a generous God, being a gracious God, is going to give us a way out, all of us. He's going to give us a way for his wrath against us to be appeased through his sacrifice of his son Jesus. Chapter 3, verse 25. In his divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. Chapter 3, verse 25. In his divine forbearance, he passed over former sins. Now, to someone like Paul, I'm going to talk a little bit more about Paul later. To someone like Paul, this phrase, passed over, is no accident. Where have we seen this phrase before? Long before the letter to the Romans was written. Okay, Passover. Passover was when God passed over their former sins. He's reminding them that for all these generations, the Israelites were sinning. They were all sinners, but they were not experiencing the wrath of God. Why? Because God passed over those sins. How did he do that? Those sins hadn't been paid for yet. That debt was still accumulating through Jesus Christ. Through Jesus Christ, God tolerated those sins and passed over them all those years until Jesus came to sacrifice to pay off that debt. And so God is seen as patient, his divine forbearance. God is righteous because in his divine forbearance, he had passed over former sins. And he goes on to explain that that was true for the Gentiles as well as it was for the Jews. He was able to pass over those sins as well to those who, not having the law, were the law unto themselves. And then he goes on to say, so at the present time, he's shown to be righteous, he's shown to be just, and the justifier, the one who makes righteous. Chapter 3 and verse 26. So for all those generations, he passed over former sins so that he could show himself to be righteous as he should be, and the one who makes others the way they should be, who pronounces right. God is fair because the pronouncement is available to all through the same avenue. Whether you're a Jew, whether you're a Gentile, whether you live before or after Jesus, he makes through the same avenue the same righteousness through faith in Jesus Christ. And if you didn't get it once, he tells you 6 times in chapter 3, verse 30, that it's through faith in Jesus Christ. It's through faith in Jesus Christ. It's through faith in Jesus Christ. Read it. He tells over and over and over again that this righteousness comes by faith in Jesus Christ. It is through that that man becomes as he should be, and he is pronounced as he should be by the faithful judge, the righteous judge, who is as he should be, our God. No one's justification depends upon adherence to law because no one ever has. If your righteousness depended upon faithfulness to adherence to law, you would be hopeless. We would all be hopeless. Everyone would ever have been hopeless because we've all violated the law. No one's ever kept it perfectly. No one has anything to boast about. None of us has earned righteousness through excellence. Chapter 3, verse 27. And I'm putting these verses up there so you don't think that these words are mine. I'm doing the very best I can to remain faithful to the text. God is the God of both the Jews and the Gentiles. And that's one of the reasons why he's counted as righteous. Because he's no respecter of persons. Took him a while to figure that out. Took Peter a while to figure it out. But finally he did when Cornelius received the Holy Spirit. He said, now I perceive that God is no respecter of persons, but has in every nation those who serve him. God justifies both, that is, everyone, both Jews and Gentiles, and that would include us, in exactly the same way. Chapter 3, verse 30, and that's by faith. Number 7, he's faithful to his covenant, and that's why he's righteous. He's righteous, he is as he should be, because when he makes a promise, he keeps it. He made some promises to the fathers. He made a covenant with them. It was a reciprocal covenant, but in a blood covenant, you don't say, I'm going to keep my part of the covenant as long as you keep your part of the covenant. You say, I'm going to keep my part of the covenant whether you keep yours or not. And God made a covenant to Abraham, and It was a blood covenant, and he said, I will keep this covenant, and he did. And by it, we see that God is faithful, that God is righteous. Because he upheld the law through justification by faith. That's the same way that Abraham was justified, if you remember. That's the way he was made righteous, by faith. Now, none of the terminology that Paul uses is used by accident. He doesn't use the word righteousness when he meant something else. He doesn't use the word sanctification when he meant something else. And I'm going to put up a few words on the board that we might have a tendency to conflate, that we might have a tendency to confuse. Think one is the other, or think that they mean exactly the same thing. But remember, Paul is an expert in the law, and so all of these words have very specific meanings. This one may be a little more challenging to see. I'm putting a lot up there. That's okay. We're not going to stop and talk about each of these words, but I just want you to go down this list, and I want you to think, as we go down the list, can you immediately recall from an understanding of the Old Testament what these words might have meant to a person like Paul? Okay? Atonement. The Day of Atonement, right? The sacrifice of blood sacrifice brought into the Holy of Holies, where the high priest only came with blood only once a year, and with that blood made atonement for himself first and then for all the people, so that they could be reconciled to God for another year. All right, there's atonement in a nutshell. Well, if Paul mentions the word atonement, he's thinking about all that history, that rich history, and the Jews that he's writing to would immediately be able to call to mind that rich history of atonement before we even begin talking about what it means to Gentiles under a new covenant. Consecration, that is, things set aside to God, things that belonged solely to him. Faith, belief, trust, I use these as equivalent words because I think they are equivalent words in the way that Paul uses them. Forgiveness, holiness. Holiness, different from sanctification, different from righteousness or justification. They're different terms, they have different backgrounds, they have different meanings. But I assure you that when Paul uses each of these words, he knows exactly which word he means, and he doesn't mean one of the others. We have to be cautious about that when we read the book of Romans. It could end up getting us twisted up in what we think about when we think about something like the word justification or righteousness. Redemption. Remember? Buy back the firstborn, redeem a slave, redeem your property, redeem someone else's property. When someone has died, Ruth was looking for a redeemer. Remember that story? Reconciliation. It's a kind of a rare concept, but it's one that's used a few times in the Old Testament and even more rarely in the New Testament. Paul uses that word here in the book of Romans, to be reconciled to God. Righteousness and justification. We spent a whole class talking about this word righteousness and what it means from the Jewish point of view. So when you see a definition and you see the word righteousness meaning right acting, but then lower in the definition you see the word also vindication. You understand that word has a very rich meaning to a Jew, and it's used in very, very differently throughout different aspects of their society. It was a common word used among the Jews for a lot of different reasons, including legal purposes. All of that rich history of that word we should be bringing to mind every time we see it and not confuse it with some of these other words. Then salvation, a word that's used several times, not nearly as much as the word righteousness in the book of Romans, but used often, 6 or 7 times maybe, because salvation is one of the topics of the book of Romans. It's not primarily the topic of the book of Romans. Primarily the topic is, as we've said, it's showing that God is righteous and showing how God makes other men as they should be, how he makes men as they should be through faith. Different concept than the concept of salvation. And then sanctification, and I put sainthood and sanctuary together because really they're all from the same word, or they're all part of the same word. We say set apart. It really means belonging to God, very closely related to that word consecration that we already talked about. So I want to just spend a few minutes talking about the Apostle Paul. Before I do, does anybody have a question or a comment that they'd like to make about what we've talked about so far? God is righteous, and he's made an avenue by which people can be made righteous, and that avenue has to do with a life-altering, rich faith. Questions or comment? Yeah.
That he starts off this chapters 1 through 3, you might say like a book, because he tells what the message is. It's like having on the front of the book, a little indication about what it's all about, and then on the back, it gets back to it. So it's interesting that he says, this is what I'm going to talk about, Jesus, and how we get out of all these things we've gotten ourselves into, and then he tells it again.
Okay, so Gene said that it is written rather like a book where you have kind of a preface that tells, okay, this is what I'm going to talk about. And he lays out the case that the Jews and Gentiles are alike or under condemnation and that they're made righteous through faith. And then he's going to talk about it. And then at the end, he's going to tell them what he talked about, right? So it's that, they used to call it, my boss used to call that the Presbyterian method. You tell them what you're going to say, and then you say it, and then you tell them what you said. The book is kind of laid out that way. But in the latter part of the book, he's going to tell them not just what he said, he's also going to tell them a lot of practical implications about what that means on our lives, isn't he? Very good. Anybody else? Yeah, Ben.
I think it's really crucial when you're talking about God's righteousness, that last point you brought up, that God's righteousness means that he keeps his word. I think it's something that, maybe it's an obvious point, but I think it's something to dwell on and think about. It's why we go to the Old Testament. That's why I sometimes kind of chafe at the term New Testament Christian. Because when you're thinking about God and his righteousness and his faithfulness, to really see it in all its beauty and all its fullness, you have to see all of the promises that he made. And how, to the smallest detail, he kept every single one of those promises. And he came through for people. And the Old Testament is so precious and valuable because it shows you just how delinquent people were to their side, to our side of the promises. And yet God was always coming through on his side of the promise. And that all leads up to the perfect outworking of those promises, which is Jesus Christ. And so this idea of seeing the righteousness of God, even in Romans, like Paul's already made a huge point about, and he's going to make a bigger point about the value of knowing the Old Testament. For both Jewish people and Gentile people, it's valuable because we see a history of God that is impeccable, always keeping his promises. And that's why we can trust in him, is because he's always kept his promises. And I just think sometimes it's hard to see the value of all this Old Testament stuff, but it really just, in some ways, is to prove the singular point. And in some sense, you can look at it, just prove the singular point that God always keeps his promise, especially even when we're not keeping our promises.
Okay. For those of you who can't hear Ben, and for those of you at home who surely can't hear him, I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. He's talking about the great value of the old law and how it provides for us the background to everything that comes later. And so to understand the richness of what you read in the New Testament, you really have to see God's promises and see them fulfilled and see how they're being fulfilled in Jesus Christ, and you have to develop that sort of sense of God's faithfulness over the period of history of the Old Testament. So thank you for that comment. I know I didn't do it justice, but my memory is not as good as it used to be, and it never was all that good. So I'm just repeating what he says best I can in a few words. I want to talk about Paul because I think helping us to understand more about Paul will help us more to understand his letter. And one of the ways that we have of understanding Paul through secular history is kind of indirect. But in the New Testament, we're told that Paul was trained under Gamaliel in Acts chapter 22 and verse 3. Just a note about him that's made in passing. But that tiny little note is really quite significant in teaching us who this guy was. Because a lot of secular history has been written about this character, Gamaliel. And the reason he's so important in secular history, the reason so much has been written about him is because he was so important in the history of the Jews. If you recall in Acts chapter 5, this fellow is mentioned again, was mentioned the first time. It was talking about when the apostles were first brought to the council to be challenged for having been teaching about this resurrected Jesus. And so they were arrested and taken before the Jewish council. And we have this guy, we as Gentiles would have, and the Gentiles in Rome would have perhaps had no idea who this guy was. Reading beginning in verse 34, he says, "But a Pharisee in the council named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, held in honor by all the people." That may want to be one of the great understatements of the Bible. Held in honor by all the people. Stood up and gave orders to put the apostles outside for a little while. And he said to them, "Men of Israel, take care about what you're about to do with these men. For before these days, Theudas rose up, claiming to be somebody, and a number of men, about 400, joined him. He was killed, and all who followed him were dispersed and came to nothing. After him, Judas the Galilean rose up in the days of the census and drew away some of the people after him. He too perished, and all who followed him were scattered. So in the present case, I tell you, keep away from these men and let them alone. For if this plan or this undertaking is of man, it will fail. But if it is of God, you will not be able to overthrow them. You might even be found opposing God." Pretty wise advice. From a retrospective point of view, those people might be saying, "Has he gone crazy? These guys are upending Judaism." But here's a guy who's actually telling them to be cautious what you do with these people. God may be on their side. That's pretty insightful from the vantage of someone who's actually watching this happen in Judea, isn't it? So who is this guy who has the respect of the council? Who can give orders to the guard to have the apostles removed? And who gives wise advice on the behalf of the apostles? His full name and title is Rabban Shimon ben Gamaliel I. And the history of him we know in a fair amount of detail. You can read an article even in Wikipedia about him if you'd like to. But this title, Rabban, is the word master, and it's not applied to just everybody. This is one of the words that Jesus told his disciples to avoid, right? Don't call any man master. Because you have a master, you have one master, and you're his servants. Okay, but this is one of the masters of Judaism. He's also given another title, Hazaken, the elder. This is applied to a very few sages. And probably most people believe that he was also, and this has been disputed about him, but he's probably was also given the title of Nasi, which is the same as prince, which meant that he was the head of the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council. So out of the 70 counselors, he was the guy who stood up in the front and gave the orders, which would explain why he's ordering the guard to take the apostles out. He not only was the master of the law of his time, he was also the grandson of a master, a master that was perhaps greater than he. And that was a man by the name of Hillel the Elder. Hillel was a renowned teacher of the law. He was responsible in part for the development of the Mishnah. And the Mishnah is a compilation of all of the traditions of the Jewish sages that goes into making up the Talmud. If you've ever heard of the Talmud or the Mishnah, this is one of the guys responsible for compiling it, okay? His knowledge of the oral traditions was so thorough that he could sit down and he could help them compile a book, a written work that would contain all the traditions of the sages all the way back as far as the Jewish history would carry them. He could repeat all those names and the lineages in the Old Testament by heart. He could tell you which verse was in the middle of all the verses, and he could tell you how many commandments there were and how many positives and negatives there were, and he would teach this to his students. In fact, there's a sculpture of him teaching one of his students the entire law while his student is standing this way, reciting the law back to him. Discipline. Such was the nature of the school of the Jews, and such was the nature of Hillel the Elder. He was born in Babylon about 110 BC. Now do the math here. He was born in 110 BC and lived until about 10 AD. So he died at the age of 120, something like that. And so his life, you know anybody else who died at the age of 120? Moses. Moses died at the age of 120, and you could divide his life into 3 40s, right? 40 in Egypt, 40 before he was as a shepherd, and then 40 leading Israel. Well, Hillel, his life can also be divided into 40s, and his last 40 was spent leading Israel. His first 40 were spent in Babylon. He was founder of one of the 2 dominant schools of the Pharisees. The other was under the direction of a man named Shammai or Shamahi, depending on which pronunciation you follow. And Shamahi was the more conservative of the 2 schools. When people came to Jesus challenging him on the question of divorce and remarriage, it was a question that had actually been raised and debated between these 2 schools, the school of Hillel and the school of Shammai. And Jesus basically agreed with the position that Shammai, the more conservative of the 2, had taken. He would have been the most respected Jewish teacher during the days of Herod and at the time of the birth of Jesus, Hillel, that is, we're talking about. So the reason that I talk about Hillel is to show you that Gamaliel, his grandson, came up in the same discipline, probably learned from his grandfather, and was, you could say, Jewish religious royalty. So he had the honor of all the people even before he became the prince, if in fact he was the Nasi of the Sanhedrin. And Gamaliel was Paul's teacher. You might wonder how a Jew from Tarsus would end up being taught by this master, the master. A pretty strong case can be made historically that Paul was actually related, and part of it, the story is related in the last chapter of the book of Romans, that Paul was related to Herod the Great, because he talks about some of his kinsmen being at Rome who were in the house of Herodian. Okay, so if Paul is kin to folks in the house of Herodian, is he himself related to the Herodian line? And there is some other evidence outside of Romans chapter 16 that Paul might have been. And that would explain how he would have access to the highest level of teaching, even though he was from somewhere else. But that just meant that Paul was able to speak and read and write fluently in both Greek and Hebrew, and knew the law like the back of his hand. And this is what Paul said about some of the other teachers, probably teachers like me, who were out there teaching at the same time that Paul was teaching. He said in 1 Timothy chapter 1 and verses 5 through 9, "Certain persons have wandered away into vain discussion, desiring to be teachers of the law without understanding either what they are saying or the things about which they make confident assertions. Now we know that the law is good if one uses it lawfully, understanding that the law is not laid down for the just, but for the lawless and disobedient, for the ungodly and sinners." So this is Paul's description of some of the other people that were pretending to teach the law the way I might teach it, who had no idea what they were talking about. Well, I probably fit better into that category than I would fit in the category of a Jewish teacher of the law, and let alone somebody like Paul, who sat at the feet of the master, of who would be called the master at that time, this Gamaliel, who's just mentioned in passing. So Paul uses a lot of technical terminology in the book of Romans. And the reason that I even bring all this to your attention right now is because when you read the book of Romans, I know it's going to be impossible for us to see it through the eyes of a Jew, or especially through the eyes of Paul. But read it with a new humility and with a new appreciation of the level of technical expertise that Paul brings to the subjects that he's writing about. And understand that when Paul uses a term, he doesn't use it loosely or sloppily or confuse it with other terms in the ways that we might. Because that has some very specific applications as we go through the book of Romans. And I may be bringing this to your attention again as we go through some of these chapters and we see some of the technical terminology. And I'll say, now remember what this word might have meant to Paul. Because we're familiar with some of this Old Testament history. We know all of the things that went into making up this term. Paul is very familiar with it, and he's using it very intentionally, and he's calling this concept to mind so that you'll remember the things that happened before as he mentions them. All right, so are those slides still available for us? Let's put up that last one again, if you please. How are we doing here? So we have many questions as we read through the book of Romans. And many of the questions that we come up with surround the usages of these words. And as you look down that list again, ask yourself a few questions. Can a person be one of these things without being the other? Which can he be without being the other? Which other? Which of these terms are relative and which are absolute in the way that Paul uses them in the text? Are people being talked about as relatively righteous when he says that you're made righteous by faith? Or are we pronounced righteous in an absolute sense? Which are relative and which are absolute? Is sanctification, for example, something that happens at a point in time or something that occurs over time? Is salvation something that occurs at a point in time or something that occurs over time, over a period of time? Or is salvation spoken of as something that occurs at a point in time and also something that is spoken of as occurring over a period of time? Or even since the beginning of time? Is it something that happened in the past? Is it something that's happening now or something that will happen in the future? I think you'll find that the answer to all of those things is yes. All of those questions is yes. Salvation is used in all those different senses, which makes perfect sense when you remember that salvation is a word that has a history and that can be applied in a number of different cases for different purposes and can have different meanings to us. We have been saved, we are being saved, and we will be saved. I think all of those are true. And Paul is aware of those ideas perhaps more than we ever could be. What questions or comments do you have before we finish? Okay, if there's nothing more, thank you very much for your kind attention, and we'll be looking forward to our class on Wednesday. Thank you.